Hi everyone and welcome to today's MediaWorks Masterclass. It's great that you're joining us on this very sunny day in July. But I guess for us, we wanted to follow up on as our part of our paid media masterclass series. Today, this is the second in our series where we're focusing on all things creative excellence. As part of that, I've got myself obviously here hosting the session again. So I'm David Norris. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at MediaWorks, and I'll be hosting today's masterclass. But I've also got Paul Mallett with me.
Hi, I'm Paul Mallett, so I'm Managing Partner at MediaWorks. I look after our strategy, insight, and very importantly for today, our creative teams. And I've been doing digital creative for a long time.
Yeah, thank you, Paul.
And hi, I'm James, Paid Media Director here at MediaWorks. So under me sit the paid search and social team, and really I'm ultimately responsible for all our paid ads and activity.
Yeah, so I think we always talk about this in terms of the format of the masterclass for anybody that's been on previously. One of the things that we're really keen to push is making sure that if you are really interested in what we talk about today, which hopefully you will be, and you see the value that that's going to drive in your business, we do offer these free audits. So today, the offer that we're going to be making to people is to do a free paid media creative audit, where we're going to be looking at a review of all your paid media creative and ensuring that sort of your paid media activity is aligned to driving the performance that you want to see. So if you do want to sign up for that, and that'll be at a category level, it'll be really focused on your industry and your particular position within the what then please do click on the link that's in the chat. We'll also be sharing the link afterwards via email, but do please sign up to that. What will happen is we'll obviously produce the audit, but then importantly, one of the specialists from the team will also talk you through that audit in a quick 30-40 minute consultation. So, do please sign up and utilize the link that's in the chat right now. As I highlighted, this is part of the Paid Media Masterclass series. So we previously delivered the Maximising Paid Media ROI, which was looking at all things audience and channel selection and where to best put your money to make the biggest impact, which was on the 27th of June. The recording is available on YouTube and via our other channels. Today, we're going to be covering all things creative excellence, and then we'll be finishing up with Performance Unleashed, which, as I say, with any masterclass, we can't not talk about AI, and we will cover bits of AI today. But we'll be following up with that session on the 25th of July. So please do sign up and join us for that. I think to start then, James, I think one of the things that we always talk about is the value that creative drives within performance. I think it's often people go to targeting or they go to budget selection or channel selection as the first point of call. But I think some of the statistics that we've seen out there, and we know from our own experience, that the creative is the single biggest driver of sales performance within the PPC paid media channels.
Yeah. I think it sounds obvious when you look at it. But it is the first thing that the user sees. It is what allows you to stand out and make a difference in that space. Getting effective creative will do more for your campaigns than any amount of AI optimization, automation, audience targeting, etc. Like it is the single biggest factor, and you can see the stats there. It's almost 50% is creative, and then another 22% is context. So it's like making sure that creative is relevant to the audience and provides the right context. So you're talking about nearly sort of 70% of your ad performance really being dictated by like, what does that visually appear as and how does that look? So it's the most powerful aspect, but it is also probably the one that requires the most development, testing, iterations, and really needs that to drive it forward. Otherwise, like it can get very stale quickly. Like there's nothing worse than creative fatigue, and that's what happens if you're not constantly updating, constantly trying to innovate in that space.
And I think, coming to you next, Paul, one of the things that I think one of the reasons that creative scores so highly in terms of one of the things that ultimately drives effective performance so much is ultimately around that. Attention is such a key aspect of this. Like we're seeing so much content now. So how do you actually even think about click-through?
And I think the difficulty is that most in performance marketing, often people jump to click-through rate as being the most important metric, and clearly it is a really important metric, but people aren't going to click unless you've grabbed their attention. So often this idea of how you're grabbing people's attention gets missed. And I think, you know, going back to, you know, 50% is about creative. Well, what does that actually mean? Well, 50% of it is about grabbing attention. You know, you can see there some data. 80% of ads fail to grab attention. We see it all the time. You know, and you will know that as a consumer, that, you know, it's the things that can jump off the page, make you look. And you know, this stat of 3.7 seconds, that's been going around for a long time. But really, unless you grab people's attention within about 2 seconds,
yeah,
you've kind of missed the boat.
Yeah, and I think again we talk about this is we see I think a lot out there is very, very generic. I mean, we were talking literally this morning, weren't we, about it in particular categories are notoriously poor for this, where what you see is one brand that in essence could be the other brand that could be the other brand, and you end up with a lot of things that are incredibly samey.
Yeah, and so I think, grab attention, but if you're grabbing attention or you're trying to do it in the same way as everyone else, then it's not going to work. And like David just said, you know, we see it across categories all the time. It used to be a real problem within, like, if you think about car advertising, that every single car ad really looked the same. And it was, you know, when Honda came along and started objects toppling over, suddenly became really distinctive. Their strapline became something really distinctive. So I think that recognising that playing to a category norm is not a good idea when you're trying to grab attention, break away from that, but then be really, really clear about what your distinctive brand assets are, double down on those and be repetitive with those. Because also within all of this, you start imprinting that idea on your target audience's brain about what your brand stands for. And that then is how you're going to get greater increases in performance. And, you know, even within performance marketing, take the element of your brand really seriously, because every time that appears, you just added a bit more. And that's one of your stats there, James, the plus 90%.
Yeah, 90% of like brand plus performance delivers. Like, it used to be a case of like brand versus performance, and I think we talked about it in the last masterclass as well. But like, ultimately, it's having a combination of both will increase your revenue and your sales, because you're projecting that brand message, you're educating people earlier on. There is resonance with the audience before you come in with your performance marketing. I also think this sea of sameness piece is quite interesting, because like even if you think about it in your like highly performance marketing creative periods, like sort of Black Friday, your big promo peaks and stuff, we found with clients that like some of the most effective, when you're just changing little, when you maybe your promo or your sale is like it's a 5% change every week or whatever, if it's the same ad in the same color format and the same style and you just change that, it doesn't have an impact. We actually found it was more successful if we started for a few of our e-commerce clients, like if we actually started just flipping the color on each transition so that the ad looked different and the audience knew it was a new offer on that transition piece. So I think it is important to make sure that there is that variation and you are doing what you can to stand out.
And I think we'll go through this as we go through the session, but I do think going to that brand versus performance, now brand plus performance piece that we've been talking about is so important, because I think that what we do see across when we do audit a lot of accounts and we do work with clients and we start to work with clients, like one of the things that we do see is the imbalance between where budget is being spent and what are we trying to achieve. And you'll see, for example, people will go, right, our objective is we want to increase awareness, and then what they have like loads of performance based activity, very bottom of the funnel with call to actions, click through rates, and you sat going, no, but you have to think about where everything fits in a funnel, which I think sort of leads us through into sort of understanding what our campaign objectives need to be. And we're not going to dwell, James, on the targeting and insights piece, because we talked a lot last week in the session, or in the last session a couple of weeks ago, and where we focused on identifying audience and segments, what does persona development, what does that drives, like understanding the different trends that we see in the marketplace. But I think for me, like we're going to go through each of these a greater or lesser extent as we go through the session today. But I think it's really important that we have an understanding of what that campaign objective is to really then drive all this other activity.
Yeah, 100%. Like the optimization cycles and the process of creating an effective creative and effective testing iteration, like it does rely on what that objective. It's a different objective if it's a performance marketing piece where like actually maybe you are trying to bottom funnel just how do I make my conversion stronger, versus actually what you try where when you're further up the funnel where it might be a bit more about branding. So I think like the audience and insights obviously informs the creative and the messaging, and that's where that comes in. But then designing the messaging is something we'll touch on it in this session, but that is the next stage on how do you make that effective for each audience. And then you look at like which channels, which formats are we using, how do we optimize that side, and then build tests, build A/B tests, build structures that you can actually take some learnings and actually have like a hypothesis going in, like people in my ad versus animated in my ad, like what works best. Like if you have those insights, you'll be able to make that structure work through all the way through to activation, and then you can optimize and learn. And I think it is a cycle because you have to, every time you do a new creative test or a new brand piece, you should be taking something away from that you can apply to the next thing.
Yeah, I think that taking the learning and then iterating is so important because, you know, we've just talked about attention, cut through, nuance, etc., and people drowning in a sea of sameness. And yet we still see a lot of examples where people just run a particular asset like for a massive amount of duration, and you sat going, the impact of it falls off a cliff, and we can actually generally you're able to see that click-through rate as a metric, for example, but you can see that, appreciating that it's not every metric, like not the single biggest, most important metric, but click-through rate's super important, and you can just see that click-through rate like fall off a cliff, and you can start seeing, and you'd be amazed how long you see, I think, like that click-through rate ultimately fall and just be accepted that it's falling for a period of time, and at that point it's no, you've got to re-energize, you've got to go back to it. So I guess the place often we start is, if going back to the previous slide, is we obviously do the targeting audience piece, but then for me it's looking at what that messaging matrix, so understanding what the key messages are, how we actually achieve that level of cut through that we've been talking around.
Yeah, so I think when we're positioning messaging, obviously we've got an audience and or various audiences and personas that we want to align to, but we also have to think about how the user is like, what is the user's experience with the brand? Is it the first time they're interacting with it when we're doing those big awareness campaigns? And at that point, we really need to be thinking about how do we shape their perception of us? How do we give them like content and context of who we are in sort of a bite-sized, memorable sort of format? And that allows us to have very effective campaigns at a very top line level and get users familiar with us. Once we built that familiarity, when we move further down the funnel into your more engagement type objectives, your traffic drivers, your soft lead conversion, signups, that sort of thing, then it's really more about education. It's like, how do they should know who we are. Like we've sold them on what we are. Now it's about how we might benefit them. Like what sort of creative and messaging can we use to sort of bring them into our brand or educate them on our product? That might be case studies, that might be testimonials, that might be like in-depth sort of product use cases, solution driven. It's about aligning to those sort of interests, but just giving them more content and more context to it, and to position the brand as not just a brand that they're aware of, but also a brand that they start to trust. And then it finally, that sort of filters down into wherever we need to drive the action, where it is more about like highlight those core USPs, clear call to action, sort of impetus on sort of time. It's like that's the focus. You need to. It's almost that immediate impact there, where you're trying to generate a sense of urgency. And if you design your messaging across the funnel, and align that with your objectives, you know at each stage what you're trying to do, and that makes it a lot easier and a lot more straightforward to design the right creative and the messaging to go with it.
Yeah, and I think it's funny, isn't it? Because we often talk about the limitations of funnel-based marketing and the fact that we have this notion that everybody starts at a reach stage, then comes down into nurture, then comes into acquire. But we know people join at different points and then jump back up. And I think it's, for me, the key thing there is that you've got the content content and you've got the assets that then speak to people on a different level. You know, if I see, for example, a promotion, that might be my first bit where you might say, right, I'm at the acquire stage and that's the first thing that I see. But then more often than not, what I'll then do is I'll then go on a bit of a discovery journey where I'll want to learn more about the brand itself before just, oh, this is a promo and I'm going to go and buy.
Yeah, and I think the biggest change here, so yeah, the funnel-based marketing thing, I think it was like everybody thought it was the advertiser was in control of the funnel, but actually it's always been the consumer that's been in control. Because like you say, the number of times that you see something, you go, I kind of think I should buy that. But before I do, I'm going to go and check who these people are. Is it for me?
100%.
Do I like their vibe? Are they ethical? Are they whatever it is? Is there something cheaper? So bottom of the funnel soon goes back to top of the funnel, and people are just zinging up and down between them. But the key thing is, like you say, is that you've got messaging that is available for each of those stages, so that when I'm ready, I can then go and, might start off reading the about us and the history of a brand. Then I'm going to go into, what product ranges do you have, blah, blah, blah,
100%.
before I start committing.
No, totally, Paul. And I think then we talked about sort of approaches to designing the right message.
Yeah, and I think things like this, so, you can't, you shouldn't skimp on any of this stage, and I think that there are a lot of different approaches to how you do messaging and talking about propositions and aligning to a funnel, and I think you can kind of get lost a little bit in between. It can become a bit of a box ticking exercise, but there's no doubt that at the end of the day, having a messaging matrix is a really good outcome to a process like this, because it helps you organise and make sure that you have addressed all these different points. But everything should always start with your audience and your insights. You should understand really how, what does your product do? How is it differentiated? What are its USPs? What's the functional benefit to the consumer? So don't just talk about what your product does, but how does it help me? It might help me be a better person, do something differently. And then the last one, the emotional benefits. At the end of the day, and a lot of research really does point to the fact that the emotional benefit and tying into memories that you have, all the Byron Sharp type thinking, is really critical. So for all the rational, people will still buy based on an emotional trigger as well. It always used to be very interesting with Procter & Gamble advertising. That they would always just demonstrate a single thing about a product. Kitchen towel that even when it gets wet, you can pick up a coffee cup. You'll remember these things, and it was always pick up a functional benefit. But what was kind of interesting behind all of that was this sense of a happy, complete home that was kind of running smoothly, and that was the underlying emotional thing all the time. So I think just be aware of it, talk about it, and flex it, and try these different things.
And I think, look, we put some example messaging matrix examples on the screen because this is one of the ways that we do it, James. But I think from our perspective, you'll see that the key elements are, we're looking at the journey stage, like what are the ultimate things going to be around the messaging, what are we going to do around the different segments, and then ultimately what are the calls to action going to be. So I think I'm not going to dwell too much on that, because again, it's probably something we'll pick up with people when we look at the audits, if people do want to obviously sign up for one of those. But I think to Paul's point, it's super important that you do, I think, map this out and have a real understanding of what you're trying to achieve at each stage, because I think sometimes you might start with an idea of what you want it to be, and then you get lost along the way, and then by the end you're sat there going, if you evaluate what you got to as an end point and the assets that you produce and the way that you ran a campaign versus what you set out to achieve, you'd probably find quite a lot of disconnects. So it's always a good reference point. So I guess in the final sort of 20 minutes or the next 10 minutes, what I'd like to cover is sort of asset development and key consideration and best practice. So I guess the big thing to highlight here, James, is there's a massive amount of optionality out there right now. Like, and we've just put some examples of like what the different paid media formats, and literally this is just an example, it's not an exhaustive list, but I think you can see on here like just different types of advertising models, creative types, etc., that is so important to understand the breadth of choice that exists out there.
Yeah, 100%. I think the variety of placement and format from the paid media segment does give you lots and lots of different ways of viewing, and the user gets lots of different experiences for that creative, like mid feeds, scroll through like video motion. We'll touch on it in a second. That's how you capture someone's attention there. If you're a display ad and someone's viewing on desktop, like how do you get that gravitation away from the content they're trying to absorb. Video ads on sort of YouTube and that sort of thing, where like your pre-roll, you can sort of force people to watch it, but then like does that have a negative connotation on the user? It does. If they see it too many times, they'll start to get sick of it. So there's a sweet spot with that, versus the skippable one, where actually if you don't have a good messaging structure, they'll lose the whole point of the story, because they'll skip after 5 seconds. So formats, there's a variety of them. There's lots you can do with them, and really you make sure that you tailor your creative to the format that you're operating on.
Can I just one little point here that I hear a lot in conversations with clients, like, oh, we don't want to do display because we know it doesn't work. I would say always just check your preconceptions, check your bias, because just for instance this week we're doing some campaigns for a client that's got different markets across Europe, and we're seeing display as being the top performer in probably 50% of them, but then other markets where it's not working. Now, so don't write off a format just because you kind of think, oh, it's a bit old hat, or it's not that effective. So keep checking it, be open-minded. I would say with all of these. I
think it's a really important point, and I think that isn't it, always challenge preconceptions, because we see this so often where we, for example, audit a client's account, and you'll find that historically they've always done something, and you start going, so why have you done it? And it'll be, because that's the best performing, and then you look and you start going, it's actually not the best performing, and what that's driving, yes, it's getting the most, for example, clicks, but the conversion rate on the back of it's terrible, or the impression share, or the CPM, that we're achieving are way off. So it's like, do challenge your assumptions.
And I think honestly, there's loads of different models, and I think you need to find the one that you really like when you're approaching how to plan what you're going to put on your ads. The Google's ABCD model is great. Grab attention. We've talked about that already. Brand early and often. And all the evidence, and Google's got more evidence than anyone else about this to say that is going to work. This idea of creating the emotional connection is really important. Then finally, what do we want people to do? And I would always say, but that everything. The point of digital has always been you can click it. So if you can click it, where are you going to go to? So, and make sure your calls to action and where your destinations are relevant to the style of the ad that you put out there. So if it's a buy now ad, I want to go to the product page. If it's a brand ad and you're trying to tell me the story of a product or your company, I want to go and explore that even more on a different page. So I think this is a really good discipline to say, is my ad doing all 4 things here?
And I think it is. I think it's a good way. It's a good checklist. But like you say, there are lots of different models out there, and I think you've just got to be prepared to engage with the theory, engage with the models that exist. But again, don't take anything verbatim. Do test, do learn, do take your own understanding into this. And I think then we talk about how do we capture attention, James. And I think we talk about here, like, I think some of the things that we often see is like a lack of awareness about visual hierarchy, where we're often highlighting the key messages or hiding the key messages.
I think the visual hierarchy is an important thing. If you think about it, you've got 3 seconds to grab someone's attention. If you're doing it with a static ad, like, you want your message, the most important message, the one that's going to resonate with the user, that's going to have that emotional connection, to be the first thing that they see. So you have to design for that, and think about what the visual hierarchy actually looks like. I think these are quite good examples on screen there, because it's where your eyes are drawn to. It's how you're drawn in. Video has similar things in terms of motion, which is obviously the next slide. Like, there's ways to innovate with that, which you can see some examples on the left, where you can play around with that animation. But really, it's about capturing attention, and particularly on social, where everybody is scrolling, and we're so used to almost passive scrolling, and channels like TikTok obviously force you into that sort of
doom scroll.
Continuous doom scroll
is what it is, James.
So like you need to work out how, like you need to be innovative and try and grab attention. Motions will draw the eye, and that brings someone in, and and you've got a couple of seconds to make them stop and stare though. So like it's about sort of getting, it's all about grabbing that attention, and I think that's ultimately what we're trying to do with some of this, and but do it in a way where you've got coverage that like it's new and it stands out. I mean, video content is the key. I think that video has been the future. That's what we've been saying for
at least 5 years.
Yeah, at least 5 years.
We've been saying video's key, but I think it's video's key in the right. It goes back to in the right setting, in the right context.
I think we don't need to go back to slide, but there's a nightmare scenario where your whole feed is full of people slightly twitching because that's the amount of animation you put in. And I still think that you've got to then think, well, is there a story that I'm being told here? And I'm going to use an example that everybody will think is like really wrong, but T-Move's advertising on mobile where they tell you little dramas, which is very in line with that kind of short story format that is really popular in China and is kind of growing everywhere. I got an ad this morning, and we're going to talk about creators and influencers in a minute, but those homemade, authentic ads that tell a story, I think are the new attention grabbers. So video, motion, but just be careful that you're not just making something move for the sake of it. You make it move because you're starting a story, and even if that story is only 10 seconds long, fine, but it's the start of something. And
it goes back to picture paints 1,000 words, etc. But video does give you a different ability to tell a story, and it allows for that emotional connection. And I think then if you start talking about this, and again, this probably helps in terms of what we've just been talking about, in terms of how you actually go out about like designing short form video. We've just talked about examples of that, but you can see here there are different stages that we need to go through to understand that. Because again, I think often people struggle to storyboard this.
Yeah, I think how do you create effective short form content is it's a very common question that we get asked. Like, advertisers will be pushing their clients towards it. It's how do you do that? And there are there's no one way to do it. There's no one size that fits all, but there are little hooks and little ideas that you can, and this is a good little framework of how you can build that. I mean, your first job is what is your attention grabber? What is the hook that's going to draw someone in? Is it audio, can you use it with audio? People we used to say designed for sound off, now it's designed for sound on. So the space changes, so audio is important. How do you grab attention with that? How do you spark someone's curiosity? Sort of starting with a question, or did you know, those sorts of things. And then once you've done that, it's about maintaining some of that attention and making sure someone actually gets the message and gets that story that we're presenting in the piece. So it's can you show how the product works? Can you do X, Y, or Z? And then your closer, your last thing, is the bit that you want them to remember at the end. That's where you have to, particularly when you're upper funnel, branding becomes important, because you do need to. It needs to relate back to who you are, so there's a consistent theme throughout it. And your call to actions obviously play a big piece there as well.
Yeah, and I think when we see people get this right, and when we get it right for clients, it's amazing the story that you can actually tell, the coherent story that you can tell in that 10-15 second slot, and really take somebody on that journey, and it becomes really clear and coherent as we go through. And again, to your point, Paul, I think we talked about creators and influencers are used to build trust and boost performance these days. It's about how they are ultimately now resonating, and there's a level of authenticity in there. And I think we used to be in a world where everybody was about producing the finished, polished ad, and we've definitely moved away from that now, where there does need to be a bit where, again, test that format.
You mentioned authenticity there, and that I think is the key thing that social influencers and creators and creators has allowed us to get from the ad. It adds that element of trust, that feeling of connection, because people connect with their influencers, the creators they follow, etc. They feel like they can trust them, and that representation that adds a sort of a part of the buyer journey, that human touch, that recommendation that maybe you don't get from sort of the traditional polished ads there.
So going from authenticity into AI. You know, we couldn't finish, and again, we've got a couple of minutes before we finish, but yeah, like we've talked about this so much, haven't we, Paul?
Well, and you know, like I'm sure a lot of agencies, but we are, you know, fully embracing AI as a tool in many parts of the business. But you know, within our creative and design teams, and you know, as soon as those tools became available within Adobe Firefly, that kind of thing, we've been exploring what the potential is for that. Many people will have seen the kind of case study that Adobe has kind of publicised with Coca-Cola. Well, Adobe is now kind of, if you Google Adobe Gen Studio for performance marketing, you'll see the new vision that Adobe has for all of this, and it is everything that you probably dreamed of. So you can brief in the goals of a campaign. You can add in your brand elements, your logo, your typefaces, templates, that kind of thing, and then ask Adobe Gen Studio to start generating multiple iterations of an advert for you, which is great. And then that very soon is going to be able to plug straight into your Google DB360 or Microsoft advertising platform, and then you can join the loop between and which is performing the best. So great, all brilliant, and I think that I don't think it's going to be available just for free as part of Google Ads for a while. It'll be part of the top dollar Adobe marketing suites, but that is very close now. I think that, you know, what we should be doing at the moment is then learning how we approach that. How do we prompt it? What kind of things are we looking for? How do you get distinctiveness when the AI is just making it can make the same thing for my competitor as it's doing for me? And there's a world in which we have plenty of clients that have got a rule that says no AI. And I think the really interesting part of this is what's in the bottom screen grab there about featureization, where you can still use all your traditionally generated ads, but then use the AI to identify what about them was driving that performance. Where can you find and unearth insights from your creative that you might not have even spotted as the commonality between the ads that perform well. So there's some very exciting stuff going on. Adobe have got some absolutely incredible stats about how this is improving performance, and it's undoubtedly the future. But whether you're using AI to generate your ads or using AI to analyze your ads, I think that's going to be a really interesting area.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to everything we talk about with AI is the guardrails you put in place. You know, you mentioned it there, it's going to be, but you've got to feed it the right information. You've got to have that structure, because if you just go auto-generate, frankly, God knows what you're going to get. But I think it's going to be so key that you've got a structured approach towards your creative. And finally, I'm very conscious of time, but I think the other thing I'd always say is, and I'll finish up with saying this, is that, you know, there is that testing and development piece that often people produce great campaigns and then they don't have that optimization piece factored in. So what we do is we see, I say, asset fatigue creep in very quickly, but it's about ensuring that you've got, you know, a view around structure, activation, and then ultimately optimization around how you're going to keep iterating, how you're going to keep making those changes that are going to drive those enhanced performance. Because the ad that you put out, I would say, in the digital space is your first attempt. You know, what I'd say is after that, you can iterate once you start learning on the back of what are people resonating with, what learnings can you take, what is actually working, what isn't, what colour, what imagery, what formats, etc. are working, and double down on the things that are winning, because ultimately that's where you're going to put your budget. Again, final point, or penultimate point really, is to just finish by saying thank you very much for today's session. If anybody does want to take us up on that free creative paid media audit, then please do, where we'll dive deeper into your specific information for your brand across all the things that we've talked about today. So please do click the link that's available in the chat, and ultimately do join us for the final of our paid media masterclass series, which will be on the 25th of July, a couple of Fridays time. We'll be talking about everything AI and automation. But thank you very much, James. Thank you very much, Paul. And thank you for joining, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. And thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Yes.